Okay, so question for you. How can the average firm or most firms have an upward sloping supply curve? So let's put a big but up here. But in micro, which I know some of you haven't had micro, but we did do this in chapter 15 with the supply curve we use. But in micro, the supply curve looked like this. And so let me pick on the beer companies for a while. If this is Budweiser or beer, the supply curve looked like this. As the price of beer went up, then Bud was willing to supply more to the market. Not only Budweiser, but lawyers and dentists and orthodontists. My son's getting into braces here, so ortho is kind of on my mind. Not exactly cheap money there, as you guys might know. So all of these producers, or most of these producers, have a supply curve that looks like this. How then could we argue that at the end of the day it all washes out to look like this? Right? Imagine that every supply curve, all of the goods that are on the shelves at Walmart, their supply curve is upward sloping, which means a higher price. If the price of the 12-pack goes from $12 to $14, then Bud is more than happy to supply 20 cases more. The quantity supplied jumps up from Q1 to Q2. We move from point A to point B. So, those of you who had micro, what were some of the things that we were holding constant, i.e. those things that will actually shift this thing, when we created this relationship, this positive relationship between the price of Bud going up and the quantity supplied going up? Price of resources. So we didn't allow the employees to get a bump in pay at the same time. So for instance, the wage of our employees at Budweiser, let's say Budweiser's a pretty good employer and they're paying $20 an hour on average. Along this supply curve, we're going to hold the $20 per hour price constant at 20. Now, if I was to play some games and say, well, what would be the quantity supplied if the wages went up to $30 an hour? What would happen? So at $14, Budweiser used to supply 120. Now are they going to supply more or less when the wages they're paying are $30? Less, right? Hypothetically speaking, at $12 an hour for Budweiser, they used to supply 100 cases of Bud when wages were 20. Now that they're supplying, or now that wages have gone up to 30, are they going to supply more or less? Less, right? And so this whole thing shifts to the left when wages are allowed to float up. And this brings me back to why this thing had this shape in the first place. Yes, all individual firms may have this, but it's because resource prices were held constant when we altered the price. Which means we can have the same thing going on in this picture using that exact same assumption. So we're going to have a separation between the short-run supply and the long-run supply. The short-run supply curve, the SAS, could be upward sloping if we make this same assumption. Short-run aggregate supply. I'll write it out and define it in a moment. Short-run aggregate supply. So short-run versus long-run. Before I do, though, let's think about this if it feels right with your gut. So if you're a business like a grocery store or Walmart or Target or whoever you want to be. As the economy's changing and it starts to slump, what do you do in response to that? What's your gut reaction? How do you behave as a producer when the economy starts to slow down but you don't know it? Remember we talked about lag times, that we might not know the economy's going into recession until 6 months down the road. So you as a private business owner, all you kind of feel is, hey, business is off a little bit. Geez, we got kind of a big inventory. What do you tend to do when you have excess inventory on the shelves? Drop the price, right? So do you drop your wages of your employees right away in response to that too, because business fell off? No, you're not going to be a very good employer. You're not going to have a lot of happy employees if you start saying, hey, listen, this is the way our business works. If business falls off, you're going to get a cut in pay. But on the good side, if business is up, you're going to get a bump in pay. Employees tend not to like that type of situation. They like a little more consistency. So when business starts to fall off, prices tend to adjust first. Now, will Walmart, Target, grocery store, whatever image you have in your mind, does that mean they'll never cut wages? No. If that recession persists, what are they going to tend to do if the slump tends to continue in their business? Whether it's due to them, by the way, or whether it's due to the overall economy, they don't know. They just know that business is off. Maybe there was a new competitor that opened up a big store across the street. You know, there could be a large number of things going on. But eventually, what are they going to do with their employees? Fire them, lay off, wage freeze, right? A wage freeze, cut in pay. So employers sometimes come to their employees and say, hey, listen, I know business is off, I really value your services, but we have to have a 5% pay cut to stay competitive with blah, 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 right? And they make some story for whatever reason. But eventually those wages could start to be affected as well. And that's kind of the heart of our story here, and the difference between short run and long run adjustments is that in the short run, it seems fairly reasonable to say that prices could be sticky. Resource prices could be sticky. All right, so let's write some of that stuff out. We'll start off with the definition here. Short run aggregate supply. SAS. Short run aggregate supply. So short run aggregate supply shows a possible positive relationship between higher price level and higher real GDP. Given that resource prices and technology are unchanged. So note, this is the same assumption used in the micro supply curve. Which is the little example that we just went through. key point is that we, it seems reasonable that there may be a lag between output and resource price adjustment. The story would be that output prices adjust first, resource prices lag behind. So output prices adjust first, resource price adjustment lags behind. Now, right now, you guys are naive to the can of worms we just opened. That is the heart of the macroeconomic debate for the last 60 plus years, probably. We can go back to Keynes. How quickly does that happen? Do resource prices lag a little bit behind or a long ways behind? So this is the heart of the argument and disagreement among economists in macroeconomics. So this is my double key, the key point. The length of the lag is at the heart of macroeconomic debate. So different theories about lag times exist and will be explored the rest of the course. Yeah, so output prices, I'm glad you brought that up. We use a lot of different words interchangeably. So output prices is the prices of final goods and services. The prices of final goods and services. The stuff that's ultimately the price paid by the consumer. That's the output. If we think back to this picture, we've got our bucket of resource prices, that those resources are physically used to make stuff. That physical process highlights the long-run aggregate supply curve. We can only have so much. There's choices to make on how much we do. And the prices of the outputs are the prices of this stuff. The prices of the inputs are the prices of the resource prices. Are what's being held constant along this short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay. Should have probably left that one. So, shifters. We kind of already did them. I want to make sure they're crystal clear here. Okay, so short run aggregate supply shifters. So number one is a change in resources. A change in resources. In other words, this is the same as the long run aggregate supply curve. So an increase in labor leads to an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve. A shift to the right. Now I want to take the time here to draw both curves, because there's a little bit of mechanics that I want to make sure we're clear on. So just draw a short run aggregate supply curve and a long run aggregate supply curve. Now, as a reminder that along this short run aggregate supply curve, nominal resource prices are held fixed, I'm just going to use a big W, which we used in chapter 6 when we talked about wages. Let's just say that the wages are constant at $10 an hour. If there's a increase in labor, the quantity of labor, holding all other things constant, then if this intersection happens to be at a price level of 100, just making up a number now. Remember, that's our base year. It's always equal to 100, but I'm just using 100 for simplicity. The change in resources is going to bump up not only our short run, but our long run aggregate supply curve. And this is how you'd show that. So our potential would move to, let's call it P2, let's call this P1. And I want you to draw it like this. So long run aggregate supply curve would move to the right, to that level. And the short run aggregate supply curve would move to that level. Notice that we haven't touched nominal wages. They're still $10. We just had a change in the resource base. But this whole thing would kind of move in harmony together on a change in resources. Questions on that at all? Kind of the mechanics of the graph. Number two on our supply shifter list is a change in technology. Once again, same thing, same type of idea is going to go on here. An increase in technology leads to a shift to the right of the short run aggregate supply curve. And it's going to look just like, looks like that. Same thing. All right, the last one's the big one. The third shifter, which remember we stopped at 2 shifters, even though it could be any of these resources in here. The third one is a change in resource prices. Well, I'm isolating it just down to short run aggregate supply. So now I'm going to free that up. And it's going to be something that'll shift the short run aggregate supply curve. So a change in resource prices. If there's an increase in wages, for instance, Another thing I should have probably put in before already, but these are nominal resource prices, not real. So it's big W. In other words, it's not this. How did we derive the real wage? Coming back to chapter 6 for a moment. Nominal over the price level. Big W over the price level. That's where we went through those examples of if I'm making $30 an hour, but the price level is 112, the real wage is 30 divided by 1.12. Right? So we're talking about big W over here now. If there's an increase in nominal resource prices, that's going to lead to a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, a shift to the left. Now this one I do want to graph out. So if we have nominal wages at $10, here's kind of the same situation we were drawing before, but now we're going to have resource prices go up from, let's say, $10 to $15. Pretty big jump in wages. The short-run aggregate supply curve at $15 lies to the left of where it was. But that in and of itself doesn't change our long-run potential. Okay. Questions or comments on that?
Why doesn't it change the potential?
What's that?
Why doesn't it change the potential?
Because we're only dealing with prices. So in the long run, we've got conceptually just be thinking of a physical amount of resources. I can only physically make so much stuff, is the way I like to think about that. All right. So our last participant into the market is aggregate demand.